Okay, let's see if we can wrap this up by building our final component, a game component, a trivia game that is. Okay, so right click here on the components folder, choose new file. Let's just call it game with a capital G.js like that, and then do your RAFCE snippet trick, and I guess you can go ahead and get rid of that import. Don't need that anymore. And here we go. We're ready to get started right here. All right, so what we're going to do is we'll start out with the props here. We're going to have two props for this game. So go ahead and put your curly braces inside of there, inside the parentheses. And one of the props is going to be the game name. And then the other prop are going to be the questions that you pass in for the game. Okay, so this is going to make it so that we can make different types of games. If we want to make a trivia game, we can pass in a name for it, like my trivia game, and we can pass in trivia questions. If we wanted to make a math game, we could pass in a different name like math game, and then different questions that are math questions. So we're making a component that's flexible and reusable here. Okay, now we're going to add the state variables here. So right there before the return statement, let's go ahead and add one. So I'm just going to set this up. We're actually going to have 3 altogether. Let's see if use state gets imported for me. I don't think it did, so I'm going to go ahead and add it here. So I have to import use state from React. Like that. I got to spell it right this time. There we go. Okay, so we're going to have 3 state variables here. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate this 2 more times with Alt-Shift down arrow. Okay. And we're going to keep track of the current question index. All right, so here, what we're going to be passing in is an array of question objects like what we saw before. So we want to keep track of the current one, the index of the current one that's being currently displayed in our question component. So here, I'm going to call it current question index. That's a lot of typing. And then even more typing here, set current question index. Okay, and then for the next state variable, it's going to be the score. We want to keep track of the score. So we'll pass in, or we'll set it to score and set score like that. And then finally, we want to know when the game is over. So we're going to use a state variable to keep track of, if they've finished the last question or not. So that's what this variable is for. Game over and set game over. Now, there are hundreds, thousands of ways you could go about doing this. I'm not sure if this is the best way, but this is just the way that I came up with here. Okay, so those are our state variables here. Now let's move down to the JSX and get everything in place right here. Okay, so I suppose we can leave it as a div. I guess that's fine, or we could use a fragment, whatever you think makes more sense for you. But what we're going to do is have an h1 element. So type in less than, h1 greater than, and then here's where we're going to display the game name prop. So inside of curly braces, put game name there. So that's going to display the name of the game here. And then what we want to do is bust into JavaScript code here, and we're going to rely on this game over state variable to either display the next question or display something that says game over. Okay, so it's if we set game over to true, then we're going to display something that says game over. If game over is not true, we're going to display the next question that the user needs to answer for the game. Okay, so what I'm going to do here in the JavaScript code inside those curly braces is use a conditional operator or a ternary operator. And it's going to depend on the game over state variable. So it's going to start out looking like this, game over question mark. And then, I'm kind of filling in ahead here, but there's the syntax for the ternary or conditional operator. So if this is true, then do what comes after the question mark. If game over is not true, then do what comes after the colon. Okay, so what we'll do for if game over is true right after the question mark is I guess we'll just display an H2 element that says game over. Okay, and now if it's not true, we're going to display our question component that we just created earlier. So after the colon, I'll put less than and then question like that. Now I don't think it imported the question component, so I'm going to have to do that up here. Import question from ./question. Okay, so that should take care of that. And now there's a few props that need to be passed in here. So this line is going to get a little bit long. So let's see how we want to deal with this. Let me play with this for just a second. I don't know. This is going to get to be some ugly code here. So it's going to really be important to format this nice and neat. I'm not exactly sure how we want to do that right now, but here's what I'm going to go with. I'm just going to kind of break this up into multiple lines. So I'm going to put the curly braces on their own line like that, and then indent everything else. And then the way I've seen this done in some cases is I've seen after the question mark, you hit enter and then indent. And then after the colon, you hit enter and indent. So kind of like that. This is a little bit hard to read, but you'll get used to this hopefully. Okay, now the other thing I'm realizing is that we're going to need more than just a question here if the game's not over. So what I'm going to do is wrap that question in a fragment. So I'm going to put the angle brackets there, and then I need to move the closing one right here like that. Okay, and what we need before the question is we want to display the question index. So gosh, this is going to get kind of nasty here. I think maybe what I'll do is I'll format it like this, like that. And then before we display our question component, we need to display the question index. So what we'll do here is put an H4, so less than, H4 greater than, and then inside of there, we'll make it say question, like that. And then after the space, we're going to bust into JavaScript code. So I put the curly braces right there, and we're going to display the current question index. But now remember, that's going to start off at 0. And because array indexes start at 0, so I'm going to add 1 to that. So current question index plus 1 like that. Okay, now one more thing here before we move on. Let's see. Right here after our conditional operator, so after those closing curly braces, we want to display the final score. So that comes right before the closing div tag. Let's do less than, and we'll use an H2, I guess, greater than, and then we'll make it say your score, like that, and then a colon, and then after that a space, and then we're going to bust into JavaScript, and we're going to display the score state variable like that. Okay. So I think we're almost done with the JSX here, except that we do have to add in the props here that we're going to be passing into our question component. So I'm going to put those on their own line. I don't really like the way this code is formatted. It's difficult to read, and there's different things we could do to try and make it easier to read, but this is what we have for now. So anyways, to add the props for the question, I'm going to hit enter and indent. And remember, we need to pass in a question. I'll just leave that blank for now. And then also when somebody submits the form with their answer, we pass in the event handler for that. And so we called that prop on answer submitted. And that's where we're at right now. We do need to fill in those curly braces. It won't compile right now if I leave those curly braces empty, if I'm not mistaken. Or if it does compile, it looks like it did compile. Anyways, let's see what we want to do next here. So I think what we want to do next is create an array of questions so that we have something to pass in as our questions prop right here. Okay, we're done with the sample component. I don't think we need that anymore. So let's just skip on over to the root component, which is app.js right here. But let's grab some code from the sample component first. So go into the sample component and then grab that question object. Now we're going to create an array of these question objects. So what you really need to take is just what's inside the curly braces right there. So we'll grab that object. It's got the ID, the question text, and the correct answer. I'm going to copy that and go over to the root element, app.js. And now, I guess, now normally this data would come from a database or something like that. And we'll get into that later in the course, but let's just put this right here before the return JSX right here. So what we want to do is create a constant and call it trivia questions. Like that, and we're going to set it equal to square brackets, so it's going to be, square brackets. And then I'm going to split those square brackets apart, and then I'm going to go ahead and paste in the first question object, and I'm going to put a comma at the end of that line, and then I'm going to duplicate that line down, and then do it again like that, and then we can change these. You can change these to whatever you want. I'll just change them real quick without recording, but go ahead and change those questions to whatever you want. Okay, so here's what I came up for my questions. You can make your questions whatever you want, but update the ID. So we've got 1, 2, and 3 for the IDs. And then now one of my questions was how many days are in January? And I entered that as a string. So we want to be real careful in React about the data types, because it's going to give us warnings if we're not really explicit in our code about the data types. But anyways, I did make that a string here. I could have made it a number, but I think it's better to leave it as a string, because as you guys know, that when people enter input, even if they enter a number, it gets data typed as a string. So I just want to keep that as a string here. Okay, so now we have some data to feed into our game component. So what I'm going to do here is let's get rid of the sample component inside of app.js. We can comment that out if we want. So I'm just going to put my cursor on that line and do control / and just comment that out. And instead, we're going to go with our game component. So here inside the main element, I'm going to do less than, then capital G game. And it looks like I'm not getting any help from maybe I did get some help from the IntelliSense. Okay, so I'm going to set it up like that, and we'll figure out the props in just a second, but I do want to scroll up and see if it got imported, and it did get imported, so I didn't have to do that, so that's nice. And now remember, there are 2 props that we can pass into our game. The first one is the game name, so we'll set that to, I don't need to use JavaScript here, I'm just going to pass in a string that's going to be trivia game. Okay, and then the other one are the questions that we're passing in. So there's the other prop questions. And for this one, I do need the curly braces because we're going to pass in a JavaScript variable, which is trivia questions. Okay, I think that's it for what we need to do here. Let's just run this and see what happens right now. I might be overlooking something, but it might run. Oh, no, it won't run. Let's see here. So we get some errors. And that's because I think I have... let's see. All right, so this is interesting. So one thing I've learned that React doesn't like is you can't, if you go into JavaScript code in your JSX, you can't leave the curly braces empty. So what it's complaining about is back in our game component here. And remember, we did not fill in the props that get passed into the question component. So it doesn't like it if you leave those empty. Okay, so let's fill in these props. I want to check something here. All right, so I want to initialize the current index to be 0. So I didn't do that. I'm going to go back up to where we declare the current index state, and I'm going to pass in 0 for that. Now I'm wondering, we should probably pass in 0 for the score. That's going to be the starting score. So I'm going to pass in a 0 for that. And then game over, what we want to pass in is false. we want that to be false because the game's not over when we first render this component, okay? All right, so I'm going to scroll back down to our question component, and what we're going to pass in is we're going to take the questions array that got handed down to us as a prop from the RIT component. So there's that, and then I want to do square brackets and pass inside the square brackets do current question index. So that should pass in one of the question objects based on what the index is. And now for the on answer submitted, let's put in a named function that we'll define up above here. Let's call it handle question submit. Okay, so I called it that because that means they submitted a question. So that's why I named it handle question submit. So what that means is we need to define this function up above. So scroll up to underneath the state variables, but before the return statement, and you can declare it as an arrow function. Handle question submit equals an arrow function. Okay, now that's not done yet. I'm going to split those curly braces apart. We'll leave it empty for now. I just want to see if we can get it to render inside of the RIT component here. So save your changes and then go back over to the browser. Okay, so it's rendering so far. So here's our game component. It actually starts here with here's the game name prop that we passed in from the RIT component, and then it displays the question followed by the index +1. So it's question 1 right here. And then here is our question component, these 3 lines right there. So we passed in the current question and as a prop to that, and then it's displaying the question text and the rest of the stuff right here, and then finally the score starts off at 0 like that. So everything looks like it's working so far. If I do click the submit button right here, that's going to trigger off like a whole chain of events. So it would be good for you to kind of walk through all that code. But just to try and get this thing wrapped up right here, this button component is going to trigger off an event handler, and then the question component, the question component is going to call on answer submitted. So it's kind of like a chain of events that are going from children up the chain to the parents. So anyways, we can talk about that in class here too. Let's go over to VS Code and finish this thing off here. So I think all we really have left to do here is to figure out what happens when a question gets submitted here. So what we want to do is we want to find out if they have the right answer or not. So here we're going to set up an if statement. I'm just going to set it up like this, set the table for it, and now we're going to have a big, huge expression inside of the parentheses here. So, and I did forget something. Now remember that when somebody answers a question, we get the answer given as a parameter right there. So I forgot to add that, but we'll get that when the question component triggers this function that we pass to it. Okay, so here what we'll do is we want to see if the answer given, we'll set it to lowercase like that. If the answer given is triple equal to, if I don't use triple equals, then the compiler will give me a warning. It won't be an error, but just a warning. So React wants us to be very explicit about our data type. So I'm going to use triple equals here. And then what we'll do here is we want to look inside the questions array and get the one that's currently displayed. So I'll use that current question index right there like that. And then I do want to drill down and get the correct answer property. Remember, every question object has a correct answer property. So I'll type that in here. And then we want to convert that to lowercase so that we compare the casing all in lowercase. To lowercase. Okay, that's a big long line and I can hardly fit it in here, but that's what we want. That's going to determine if they answered the question properly or not. Okay, if they did, then what we do is we want to bump the score up by 1. Okay, so inside the curly braces here, we're going to call the set score function. So I'll do set score, And what we'll pass in is we could do score plus 1, score plus 1 like that. But some people would say you shouldn't do that. If you're going to use a state variable when you're setting that variable, you should use the arrow function approach ahead like I showed you. So I'm going to comment out this line. You can leave it there if you want. But the purists would say that you should do it this way. Set score, and we should pass it an arrow function that's going to have, usually they call that parameter prev, like for the previous score. So I'll just call it prev. And then here, I actually don't need the curly braces here. We can just return prev plus 1 like that. So that's going to bump up the score. Now let's see if that's working. So save the changes and then go back over to the browser here. There's my first question, and I'll answer correctly, which is blue, and hit enter. And look at my score did get bumped up. Okay, now at this point we'd want the new question to display, and it's not doing that. So let's figure that out right here. So go back over to VS Code, and we're going to put another if statement here inside of our handle question submit function. So put your cursor right there and hit return a few times, and set up an if statement. Set the table for an if statement like that. And then what we'll do is we want to find out if the current question index is less than the length of our questions array minus 1. Less than questions dot length minus 1. This kind of reminds me of the image gallery that we did last year. Okay, anyways, so inside of here, what we want to do is bump up the current question index so that it's going to display the next question. So here I'll do set current question index. And now again, in this case, I should be passing in an arrow function as the parameter here. So I'm going to set that up. Okay, and then what we can do here is this will give us the previous value. So I could call it prev or prev index if I wanted to. And then what we want to do is return prev index plus 1. So I am going to remove these curly braces right here so it does an automatic return. I don't know if you remember that, but I'll do prev index plus 1. And if I want to abbreviate this a little bit more, I could remove the parentheses around the single parameter. Okay, so that's going to bump up the current index by 1. And we want to add an else here. So if we end up in this else branch, that means that we've shown the last question and there's nothing else left to show. So at this point, I want to set game over to true. Okay, and now look at what that's going to do. Once game over gets set to true, we're changing a state variable right here, which is going to cause the component to re-render. It's going to rerun our component function. And this time, game over will be true. And so we'll see this H2. Okay, let's see if all of this is working here. Go ahead and save your changes and go back over to the browser. And let's answer the first question here. We'll answer blue. Okay, now look at that. So this is interesting. The user interface depends on the current question index. So whenever that changes, it's going to re-render the component. And then over here, it's this bit right here, right here. So whenever current question index changes, it's going to cause a re-render. That's why it's re-displaying the new question inside of our question component. Okay, and let's go ahead and answer these questions. How many days in January? 31. And then who wrote Harry Potter? Now my score looks a little messed up, but I think it will. Let's take a look at this again. I'm just going to refresh. Okay, so score is 0. And then I'm going to answer blue and hit enter. Okay, and then here, how many days in January? I think there was a glitch with the score. 2, that looks like it's working. And then I'll get this one wrong, so I'll just type in gibberish. Okay, now look at what happened there. My score stayed at 2. Game over became true, so it's rendering our H2 element that says game over instead of the question component. Okay. All right. That's a lot of stuff. But hopefully it helped to reinforce some of the React principles that were introduced to you in the last project. So now we could go a ways with this. I thought about making it so that you could do a math game or a trivia game. Maybe that would be a good assignment for you guys to work on. Maybe I'll think about that. But we've got this game component that's flexible. You can pass in the game name and the questions. And so we could reuse this component elsewhere in our app. So we could add a math game just by using this component here. Okay, a lot of stuff, but we made it. It was a long series of videos, but great job on sticking with it. All right, we'll see you in the next class.